Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti al nostro penultimo appuntamento del seminario permanente di storia del papato. Questa sera ho il piacere di ospitare come relatore Sam Kuchnen dell'Università Cattolica di Lovanio, dove ha conseguito il master in storia nel 2019 e dove attualmente è archivista presso il Centro di Documentazione e Ricerca sulla Cultura e la Società Religiosa. Inoltre, dal 2022 è ricercatore dottorale presso il Deutsche Historische Institut all'interno di un progetto volto ad indagare il pontificato di Pio XII dal titolo The Global Pontificate of Pius XII. I suoi interessi hanno spaziato, diciamo, dall'idea dall'identità europea, diciamo, alle soglie della contemporaneità, perché nella sua tesi di master si è occupato della Russia e l'Europa civilizzata, andando ad indagare come l'immagine della Russia nel Belgio abbia influito sulla costruzione dell'identità europea contemporanea. Oggi invece ci parlerà del suo argomento, il suo progetto di ricerca, che è il ruolo dell'internazionalismo cattolico e del suo sviluppo tra il 1945 e il 1958 e come questo internazionalismo cattolico si sia sviluppato sotto il pontificato di Pio XII, anche alla luce delle nuove conoscenze che ci vengono dall'apertura degli archivi. Quindi è con piacere che do la parola al nostro relatore. Sam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good evening to everyone. First of all, many thanks to Professor Verardi for the introduction, for the invitation. The same goes for Professor Regoli. It's very great to be here at this wonderful place, a great opportunity. I will today present in English. My research is a work in progress, as is my Italian, I'm afraid. It is a dream of mine to hopefully come back one day and present in fluent Italian, but that is not today. Let me begin my presentation today by looking at two recent, I say recent, they are already a decade old, news items. First on the left is a news item that appeared very much in the beginning of the pontificate of Pope Francis, in which he was very straightforward in saying and warning people that they should not consider the church an NGO, a non-governmental organization. This is a point he has since repeated several times, saying that the church is about Christ and not an NGO. On the right side, you see an article that appeared in The Economist, and I found very funny to contrast with Pope Francis' expressions. And as you can see, it says, Pope CEO Management Tips for the Catholic Church. And below, you can read that the Roman Catholic Church is the world's oldest multinational. It has 1.2 billion customers, 1 million employees, tens of millions of volunteers, a global distribution network, etc., etc., and a successful emerging markets operation, which signifies the missions, I assume. But this goes just to show you that actually this idea of the church as an international organization, a multinational, an NGO, according to some, is very much a contemporary idea, and an idea that is very present, I think, among a large part of the population. But we should ask ourselves, where does this idea come from? And we should also acknowledge that there is perhaps a reason why some people consider that the church is an NGO, and that is because today there are over 50 or over 60 perhaps Catholic international NGOs active. And I think for a lot of people, especially non-Catholics, I assume that these NGOs are perhaps more visible than the church itself, especially in certain areas of the world. So if one would compile an overview of the Catholic Church today, we cannot only point to the Pope, to the Curia, to bishops, archbishops, and cardinals, but we should also consider the plethora of Catholic international organizations. And this is actually Catholic internationalism. And Catholic internationalism in this form is a fairly recent phenomenon. This explosion of Catholic internationalism, this expansive growth of their activities is only a recent phenomenon that dates from the years immediately after the Second World War. There have been three waves of Catholic internationalism. A first wave already in the late 19th century, a second wave in the interwar years, and a third wave in the post-Second World War wave. Today I want to discuss this third wave because it is the remnants of this third wave that we still see today. But first, a remarkable observation. That is actually this first wave of Catholic internationalism. Research has convincingly shown that the papal zouaves were actually one of the first forms of Catholic internationalism. This mobilization of the faithful responding to Pio IX's troubles in Risorgimento times. They gathered from all across Europe in order to fight literally for the Pope. And this brings us a remarkable observation if we place this on the timeline of Catholic internationalism, because something strange happens. That is, in this first wave, we see that Catholic internationalism is a very ultramontane phenomenon. It literally consists of bringing people, finances, and all kinds of other resources to Rome, literally to Rome, in order to help Pius IX in his temporal struggles. Whereas if we fast forward 60 years from then, and we look at this third wave of Catholic internationalism, we see actually that this is precisely the opposite almost that is happening. That we witness a process of proto-NGOization, the rise of many Catholic international organizations that start operating more or less autonomously and that are actually expanding their activities away from Rome instead of concentrating their activities on Rome. So this is an interesting dynamic just to start the lecture with and to keep in the backs of your heads. What I want to discuss today is this later period that I describe as the difficult breakthrough of Catholic internationalism. It is possible to distinguish three phases in the attitude of the Vatican towards Catholic internationalism in the post-war period. A first phase that I call laissez-faire, a second that I call intervention, and a third that I call instrumentalization. I want to discuss these three steps today with you. But if you want to know what happens in the post-war period, I really want to give a very quick glance over Catholic internationalism in the interwar period. Already in the interwar period, we see a plethora of Catholic international organizations that are founded and that start to expand their activities. However, if we can characterize them, we see that these international organizations seek to systematize contacts between Catholics from different nations. The organizations that emerge in the interwar period are actually information offices, permanent secretariats, for example, secretariats that regulate the practical aspects of various pilgrimages that occur every once in a while. But we see that these international organizations, they don't take a supranational form, in the sense that they don't have any authority, actually, over the Catholics they group. And one example, actually a very exotic example of interwar Catholic internationalism is, for example, the Esperantist movement. The Catholic Church really actively stimulated Esperanto as a language, and a lot of Catholics were engaged in what was called Internatio Catholica, the Catholic International, which was an Esperantist organization. Interwar Catholic internationalism was really shaped by a kind of limited Vatican tolerance towards Catholic internationalism that, in my view, rested on two key points. First is that Catholic international organizations could thrive if they were actively advocated and protected by powerful figures in the Roman Curia. Secondly, international organizations could thrive if they weren't threatening other institutional structures of the church. For example, as long as they were information offices, permanent secretariats, for instance, there was not necessarily an issue. And we will see an example that shows what happens when it did become an issue, and that is when international organizations started to work in the field of internationalized apostolates. For example, the internationalization of Catholic action, that was very much hierarchically structured in the dioceses, that did become a problem. 2 points, 2 quick examples. The first example is the Ligue Apostolique des Nations, a kind of rapprochement organization that starts in the aftermath of the First World War and is founded by a Belgian Redemptorist father, Auguste Philippe. And this becomes an international organization. Why? Because it is very much protected by the very powerful figure of Cardinal Willem van Rossum, who was also a Redemptorist father and who was very influential in the Vatican. And he was a close friend of Father Philippe. So the reason why this league could exist is because it had Cardinal van Rossum as a kind of protector. What happens in the field of Catholic action, where there is an attempt to launch an international secretariat of Catholic action, this immediately the door is immediately slammed shut on this secretariat by Monsignor Pizzardo. He sends a letter saying, actually, we do not believe that there can be organized something like Catholic action on the international level. So there is a very limited Vatican tolerance, and it is really dependent on the subject of Catholic internationalism in the interwar period. This is important to understand this first phase that occurs after the Second World War, which is this laissez-faire dynamic. What do I mean by laissez-faire? If we want to know what it means, we first have to look at what happens. In 1945, there is what we call the third wave of internationalism. We see that among Catholics, there is a renewed international consciousness. There is, across all parts of the world, among Catholics, the impression that the Second World War was a shared experience, and that in order to solve possible future problems, things should be tackled internationally. The phrase international problems should be solved internationally is very common in this time. Second point is a rise of secular internationalism. For example, the creation of the United Nations and the specialized agencies such as UNESCO, for instance. Catholics witness the rise of secular internationalism. They know what happened with the League of Nations in the interwar period, and they are thinking, well, we really should hop on the train this time and not let internationalism depart without our presence. And of course, the final but important point is the now globalized threat of communism. Communists are still seen as the kings of internationalism, the founders of internationalism, and the one that should be rivaled in the international sphere. This leads to an explosive growth of Catholic international organizations that now take a distinctively different form than in the interwar period. Now we see international organizations that become coordinative superstructures, that actually become organizations that exert a kind of authority over movements at the basis. For example, you have the Jeunesse ouvrière chrétienne internationale, Jeunesse étudiante chrétienne internationale, etc. These are new types of Catholic international organizations that emerge. This new kind of Catholic internationalism causes a variety of issues for the Vatican. Why? Because it is supra-diocesan. There is in the Church actually no level above the level of the diocese except the Holy See itself. So the question immediately arises, now that we have Catholic international institutions, who within the Church should actually be responsible for them? We cannot delegate this to bishops, the Vatican reasons, because the organization is, by its nature, bigger than a diocese. So this immediately poses problems. And a second reason is that they are also interdiocesan. So their activities cross from one diocese into another. People, Catholic international activists, depart in one diocese and start doing things in another. So this immediately also creates the question of an international mandate. How can Catholic international organizations deploy their activities without constantly interfering in other dioceses' affairs? So this is another question that for the time being remained unsolved. And I say unsolved because really the Vatican struggles to respond to this initial outburst of Catholic internationalism. There are many reasons for this, but I think the most important one is that the Vatican has other concerns in the aftermath of the Second World War. It has other problems that require more urgent attention. Secondly, because there is a kind of factionalism regarding internationalism within the Curia. I show you the figures of Monsignor Montini and Monsignor Pizzardo, who were actually very opposed to each other in this matter. This is not to say that the one was pro-internationalism and the other was against internationalism. No. Actually, the reason was they were both pro-internationalism, but in a different way. Montini wanted to delegate more, though carefully, more autonomy to these organizations, whereas Pizzardo was the strict, hierarchical, top-down, nil sine episcopo, everything comes from Rome. That was Pizzardo's line. And as long as both men cannot agree in this subject, it is very difficult to engage with Catholic internationalism for the Vatican. And then also, third point is that there's actually no practical experience with Catholic international organizations. So, especially in the post-war period, when you have two sub-secretaries of state, Montini and Tardini, it is very much a question on whose desk does Catholic internationalism belong? And for a long time, it is really undecided, I think. So there is a Vatican struggle to respond that makes actually that Catholic internationalism has very much difficulties to expand and to operate effectively. Why? Because there is an outburst of Catholic international organizations, but it is very difficult for them to develop their activities because they are not actively supported by the Vatican. They are not actively supported by, for example, papal nuncios, apostolic delegates, but also by the local episcopate, because all of these actors haven't received instructions from the Vatican on how to deal with these matters. And secondly, Catholic international organizations lived in a permanent state of insecurity because they simply did not know whether the Vatican approved of their new initiatives and of their new activities. Things begin to change towards the end of the 1940s. There is a kind of international consciousness brewing in the Vatican, and we see this in a very lengthy speech given by Monsignor Montini to the International Meeting of Catholic Action, in which he kind of addresses himself this delay in responding to Catholic internationalism. He says, well, there were doubts on whether internationalism was effective, and now he says, for example, I read a small part. Je disais qu'aujourd'hui l'histoire appelle, sollicite le réveil des activités internationales. Il naît beaucoup de mouvements internationaux sous diverses formes, mais seule l'Église catholique a un vrai caractère international, universel. Elle seule est le vrai mouvement international. And then a very important addition is that Montini calls onto these Catholic international actors to stop having fear, to stop fearing the Vatican. He says, dites-le à vos amis qu'il n'y a pas lieu d'avoir peur de Rome, de la curie romaine, de l'impérialisme catholique. Rome est ferment, Rome est racine, Rome est dynamique, Rome brille, elle est la lumière, elle est l'invite. Rome est notre patrie, c'est la patrie de l'apostolat, c'est le centre de la liberté et de la vitalité qui veut la conquête d'un monde nouveau qui veut se construire. This is indicative of a turn towards internationalism by the Vatican. And this signals that we enter a second stage, the stage of intervention. Let me first discuss the motivations of this shift in attitude. A first and very easy to overlook motivation is that this Vatican intervention was actually demanded by Catholic international organizations themselves. It is very easy to see the history of Catholic internationalism as a process in which the Vatican seeks to regain control and regain power. But actually it was also the other way around. Catholic international organizations knew they needed Vatican support for their activities in order to exist, so they start actively soliciting the Vatican to take a closer eye, to get actively involved. A second motivation is that the Vatican indeed does begin to observe the Catholic international landscape and detects a variety of tensions. All of these Catholic international organizations doesn't seem to get along so well. They detect a variety of tensions, and they argue that the Vatican is actually the only actor that can pacify these tensions. A third reason is more global. That is that I think the Vatican, in the context of Cold War and decolonization, begins to realize that there is a certain danger to the global position of the Catholic Church, and that actually there is the need to mobilize the laity. The Vatican starts to realize that the battle against communism, that the transition from colonial to independence, that these are transformations that cannot be sufficiently addressed by priests, bishops, and the clergy alone. The laity too needs to be involved. And this turn to the laity can also be explained by what we, in the sources, we see recurring many times, the so-called priest problem. The impression that in Latin America, in Africa, there weren't enough priests for the apostolate, so that a part of the apostolate needed to be confided to the laity. So there are many reasons why the Vatican starts to intervene with Catholic international organizations, but all with the same objective, and it is to streamline Catholic internationalism, to make it into a solid bloc that is able to fight off communism, that is able to Christianize the international environment of the United Nations, the international environment of UNESCO, but that is also a striking power to weigh on local affairs, on politics, and, for example, on in the politics in newly independent states. So actually, we can kind of compare it to what happens in post-war Italy, that there's a massive call to the laity to save the elections for Christian democracy. And actually, this is part of a broader movement that turns towards the laity and towards lay organizations, also internationally, to rush to the aid of the church. How does this intervention then look like? Well, I think it's possible to speak of 4 things that the Vatican begins to do in this period. The first and very important one is restricting the amount of international Catholic organizations. We see, for example, a letter in 1950 sent to the Cardinal van Rooij, the Archbishop of Mechelen, who has the city of Brussels in his diocese. And Brussels was then, as it is now, a center of international activity and also the seat of many newly created international organizations. And basically, the Brussels nunciators says to Van Rooij, to Cardinal Van Rooij, over the past few years, there have been too much bureaus, committees, that have called themselves Catholic and internationalism. It is your task to make sure that this stops. And they say, very important, no organization can call itself a Catholic internationalism, a Catholic international organization rather, without express approval of the Holy See. So this is a restriction of the explosive growth of Catholic internationalism. A very important step to get a hold on the phenomenon. Secondly, the Vatican starts to kind of police these international organizations by forcing them or going into an interaction that results in a set of statutes for each and every of these organizations. And these statutes become a way to ensure that these Catholic international organizations stay within the lines of what the Vatican intends for them. And then there's also influencing and pacifying going on. And to illustrate these final 2 dimensions, I want to quickly point out the position of the Vatican Permanent Observer near UNESCO. This is a function created in 1952, and the first permanent observer was actually Monsignor Angelo Roncalli, who was then the nuncio in France. So he actually had a double function because UNESCO was based in Paris. They simply said, well, we need a permanent observer, and Roncalli, you are already in Paris, so you can go and do it. But this indicates that this was really seen as a kind of side hustle, almost, for the nuncio. And actually, when the Vatican starts to pay more attention to internationalism, they, upon Roncalli's departure, they actually appoint a separate permanent observer that is no longer the nuncio in Paris, namely Monsignor Giuseppe Sensi. And Sensi starts to deploy a wide range of activities that interact with Catholic international organizations. And one of the issues he immediately encounters is that there's a kind of infighting going on between these Catholic international organizations. And a lot of this has to do with the kind of 2 kinds of international Catholic organizations that exist at this point in time. It is on the one hand federative structures, and on the other hand specialized internationals such as the Jeunesse Ouvrière Chrétienne Internationale, the Jeunesse Étudiante Chrétienne Internationale. Now, why is this a problem? This is if we kind of dissect the way in which these federative structures work, we see that, for instance, the Fédération Internationale de la Jeunesse Catholique exists of various national branches. It groups all of the youth Catholic action branches of all countries in the world that are affiliated. For example, the ACGB, the Belgian Association Catholique de Jeunesse Belge. But within this organization, within this ACGB, we also have not only unitary Catholic action, but also the specialized models, such as the GOC and the GEC. Whereas, for example, Italy is also affiliated to the Fédération Internationale de la Jeunesse Catholique, but here the youth landscape is way simpler. It is simply the Gioventù di Azione Cattolica. But what happens is that at the same time, specialized organizations like the Jeunesse Ouvrière Chrétienne Internationale and Jeunesse Étudiante Chrétienne Internationale, they exist. And actually, as members, they have these GOC and GEC movements that exist within these countries. So there is a kind of problem, an overlap between both organizations. And at the same time, this overlap is not only on the national level in terms of affiliation, but also on the international level, because the Fédération Internationale wants that organizations like the JOCI and JECI become a part of their organization. And they say, well, if we are this one unitary youth structure, why don't you simply cease to exist? And of course, it is very easy to see why there's a lot of conflict in this particular field. So Monsignor Sensi arrives in Paris, and he sees that during every UNESCO gathering, Catholic international organizations fail to act as one bloc because they're divided. And so he tries to address these issues and tries to pacify these matters. I won't go into detail about this. This is just to illustrate a kind of new intervention by the Vatican. And this actually brings me to a third stage, when this initial intervention is completed and we move on to a stage of instrumentalization that I describe as a point in which Catholic internationalism has become fully integrated within the Church and has become an integral part of Vatican international diplomacy. And I will illustrate this very briefly by an example, and that is the example of Vietnam after 1954, when former Indochina was partitioned into North Vietnam under the presidency of Ho Chi Minh communist regime, and South Vietnam under the leadership of Diem. What happens in Vietnam is, actually in South Vietnam, is we should really consider this from the history of the independence struggle. So in the violence that follows the Second World War, actually we see that all of the, what we can call Catholic civil society is actually almost wiped away. Catholic action ceases to exist. A variety of Catholic organizations that were active cease to exist due to the independence struggle. So, in this newly created state of South Vietnam, under the leadership of a very devout Catholic prime minister, the question immediately rises, well, how can we rebuild Catholic Vietnam in South Vietnam? And we see that international organizations, Catholic international organizations, are a very crucial part of this strategy, of this rebuilding. We see that Catholic international organizations start to circulate information. They start to make sure that grassroots movements of Catholics in South Vietnam get the opportunity to partake in larger international gatherings. And on the flip side, international organizations function as a kind of transporter of information about the repression that happens in North Vietnam. For example, a famous example is the so-called Livre Rouge de l'Église persécutée, that is a compilation of stories of how the church suffers under communism, with a very important part on North Vietnam and Vietnam in general. And this book is really circulated by these international Catholic organizations. They also play a vital role because some of the main Catholic internationalists, such as Vittorino Veronese, former president of Azione Cattolica, but at this point in time, General Secretary of UNESCO, he becomes a very important figure. He travels to Vietnam. He gains information for the church on the state of the church, on the state of refugees from North Vietnam, and actually is very keen that in international gatherings there would be some kind of joint delegation consisting of Catholics from South Vietnam, but also northern refugees that would partake. So it's really about rebuilding Catholic Vietnam, not only on the scene, but also integrating it into, on the international level, making sure that Vietnam is heard and seen in international organizations. So this is just a quick example that really shows how, in a later stage, toward the end of the 1950s, Catholic internationalism becomes an aspect of Vatican diplomacy. And this is very clearly seen in a kind of instruction sent by Antonio Samoré, the Secretary of State, to all papal representatives across the world, in which he says that it is their task to support the penetration of Catholic internationalisms near other international organizations. So this is really a total shift if we compare this with this attitude of 10, 12 years prior. So I hope this lecture succeeded in giving a brief overview of what happened after the Second World War and how things changed and why things changed. Thank you very much for your attention.